Everybody, welcome to our Tuesday evening service on Facebook Live. I just appreciate you coming on. If you have a chance, please hit the share button. We are on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday nights at 7 p.m., 10:45 a.m. on Sunday mornings. Tomorrow will be Dr. Peg at 7 p.m. Friday night will be Pastor Tim, continuing on with the message that he had last Friday. And Sunday morning at 10:45, I will continue on with my Sunday morning service on my part two of the same God yesterday, today, and forever. So tonight I'm going to do things just a little bit differently. I have just a single message for tonight, a short one that might sound familiar, but because I use a lot of the same scriptures, but I just really wanted to remind you that He was faithful in the past, God was, and He will be faithful in your future. Sounds a lot like the same yesterday, today, and forever. But I, I don't know. I really, you could say the Holy Spirit's got me stuck on this. That a quote from Derek Prince. He said, "Every time you come to a turning point or a choice of a way in your life, pause and begin to acknowledge God. Thank Him for all He's already done for you, for all His faithfulness, for the way He answered so many prayers and solved so many problems in your past. And then having acknowledged Him just on trusting Him to be as faithful in the future as He has been in the past, know that He will direct your path." And as people are starting to come on, it's great to see you all have dealt with different things in your past that God has come through. He has blessed you, and He will bless you in your future. He will direct your paths. And that's what's so important for all of us to realize. So tonight, I just want to say God will direct your path if you are obedient to Him. So remember, He was faithful in the past, and He will be faithful in the future. And so, of course, for tonight, I'm going to use Proverbs 3, 5 to 12 in the Message Bible. It's really, really good. It says, "Trust God from the bottom of your heart. Don't try to figure out everything on your own. Listen for God's voice in everything you do. Everywhere you go, He's the one who will keep you on track. Don't assume that you know it all. Run to God, run from the devil. Your body will glow with health. Your very bones will vibrate with life. Honor God with everything you own. Give Him the first and the best. Your barns will burst, your wine vats will brim over, but don't, dear friends, resent God's discipline. Don't sulk under His loving correction. It is the child He loves that God corrects. A father's delight is behind all of this." And in the Amplified, it says, "Trust in and rely confidently on the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own insight or understanding. In all your ways, know and acknowledge and recognize Him, and He will make your paths straight and smooth, removing obstacles that block your way." And the Passion says, "Trust in the Lord completely and do not rely on your own opinions." I thought that was interesting. With all your heart, rely on Him to guide you, and He will lead you in every decision you make. Become intimate with Him in whatever you do, and He will lead you wherever you go. So, I mean, these are promises that God wrote, and I liked all the different versions. They're great. We all have a chance to stand on the promises of God, but our problem is we just don't. We don't stand on the promise. We don't turn to Him in the good times, let alone we always seem to turn to Him in the bad times. But what about the good times? What about the times we struggle just a little bit? Do you hand it over to Him? Well, one writer said this concerning the scriptures. She said, "I just want to point out that there are conditions with that verse, Proverbs 3 through 6, just like with many other of God's promises in the Bible. There is God's part, but there's also our part." And people don't like to hear this. God has His part, we have ours. You're not going to be blessed if you don't do your part. God's part is that He will direct our paths, but only after we have been obedient with His directions. In this verse, we see that we need to trust in the Lord in all our ways, not just sometimes. And I think we all struggle with that. Everybody does, but the more we trust Him in more and more of our ways, the easier it becomes. We need to trust Him and turn to Him no matter what is going on in our lives. We need to rely on Him for truth, guidance, and strength. We need to trust that He knows what's best for those who love Him, even when it doesn't look like it's best because things are so hard. I know it can be a challenge. Look at what the disciples went through in the Bible: prison, beatings, mockings, and yet they knew it was worth it to proclaim God's truth wherever they went. We also need to lean not on our own understanding. And for Americans, that's hard because we're taught to be independent. We're taught to try to figure things out on our own, and there's nothing wrong with that to a point. But when we start relying on ourselves and not God, then we have a problem. See, that means we need to ask for God's wisdom. We need to trust and look to Him because we will never understand all of God's ways. And I thought about that for a moment, and people say, oh, you got to ask God about everything. Well, as you read the scriptures and you get to know Him and His character, there's oftentimes you don't need to pray about it because you know what is right and what is wrong. It's right there in front of your face. The Bible tells us that God's ways are higher than our ways, and He sees the big picture when we can only see a tiny spot in the picture. When we ask God what He's trying to teach us through our experiences, He'll reveal it to us. He might not reveal it to us in our time or in the way we expect it, but He will reveal it to us. Remember to ask Him and expect Him to answer. See, a lot of people say, well, God never answers me. God never answers my prayer. Well, He does, but are you listening? Finally, we need to acknowledge Him in all our ways. I know it's a hard thing to do, especially in society that's trying to kick God out of everything. We need to speak up when given the opportunity to bring glory to God, but we also acknowledge Him with how we talk and what we watch on TV, what music we listen to, and how we dress, among other things. God will not direct our paths when we are choosing our own. We need to obey His word, and we will be greatly blessed, even in the hard stuff. A great woman of God, Corrie ten Boom, many of you know of her. She lost her whole family in the death camps in World War II. She survived. This is what she said: I've experienced His presence in the deepest, darkest hell that man can create. I have tested the promises of the Bible, and believe me, you can count on them. I mean, that's a pretty bold statement, isn't it? I think it is. The scriptures I've been keying in on: trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct your paths. For many people, this is a memory verse, both because it's quite briefly and beautifully phrased, and also because it's one of those snippets. Peggy loves using that word snippet, that can be a kind of life mantra. Often, though, when we read that verse, the emphasis is on the first sentence, while the second sentence, that of acknowledging Him and allowing Him to direct us, gets closed off. And I really thought a lot about that, and it's so true. I read recently, and I read it recently. I got to say this right. And the word acknowledge jumped out at me because I had never really ever thought about what it really means. And understanding acknowledge, and everybody goes, oh yeah, acknowledge, I know what that is. Well, see, while the technical definition of the word hasn't really changed, the way our society uses it definitely has. Basically, to give a nod to, like, oh yeah, I understand, I acknowledge that. So, and that's the superficial, way of looking at it. If you're walking down the street and you see someone you met before, you often acknowledge them with a nod or a wave, basically saying, yeah, I see you, or I acknowledge you. Or you may acknowledge someone when they give you a gift, or in the centuries past, a nobleman might acknowledge An illegitimate child is being his own by bestowing some legitimacy. So, by today's standards, in all your ways acknowledge him is basically the equivalent of a professional athlete pointing to the sky after a touchdown, and it's meaningless. I mean, we see that all the time, don't we? The trouble is that these understandings of the word render the verse in Proverbs very distant and cold, when the meaning is much more powerful. On this a few times, which generally means to know or recognize. In the case of Proverbs 3:6, it is to know his ways inside and out, and to acknowledge that he is the ultimate arbitrator of our lives. So, as you know him intimately from the inside out, you don't always have to pray about things because you will know what he wants because you've studied, you've asked him, you've been there before. It's like my children, they know my answer in certain situations. They don't even have to ask because they've been down that path before and they've seen the answer. See, the word itself, it's a root word, so it can be translated many different ways. Acknowledge, and is used almost 1,000 times in the Old Testament. While most translations use acknowledge, the NIV says, "In all your ways submit to Him." New Living Translation says, "Seek His will and all you can do." I thought that was it. Seek His will in all you do. I'm sorry. Seek His will in all you do. Throughout the rest of the Bible, yada is most often translated as some form of to know or known or know or knowing. But other uses include respect, understand, be sure in or consider, discover and discern. And these start to paint a more complete understanding of what the word yada really means, or acknowledge. Webster's dictionary defines acknowledge as recognizing the rights and the authority or the status of someone or something, which is certainly more intense than the way we typically think of acknowledgement. Now, I thought that was interesting. Recognizing the rights and the authorities or status of someone or something. So, do we? Do we recognize who God is when we say that? So, if you're acknowledging someone's authority, you're acknowledging that they have power over you. I thought that was a powerful statement. Acknowledging God is not a surface tip of the hat, like, hey, nice to see you, but rather a life-altering change in a person's life. In Psalm 51:3, David says, "For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you only have I sinned and done this evil in your sight." See, David is confessing God's authority in his life, authority that had major consequences for him when David strayed from allowing God to guide him. In a pulpit commentary, it says, "To acknowledge God is to recognize in all our dealings and undertakings God's overruling providence, which shapes our ends, rough hew them as we will." I thought, so I don't know if you know anything about hewing. And you said, what is hewing? Well, a rough hewing is in the old days they would get a tree and they would have this. It was a tool, and I think they called it a hew, HEW, and it looked like an axe turned sideways. And they would hew the bark off of the bark, and they would shape it so that it would be flat on one side, so they could stack the logs. So I thought interesting how it shapes our ends. It should shape who we are when we acknowledge who He is. There's just no way around the fact that acknowledgement of God is active rather than passive. Most people will wear a cross necklace or give God a shout out when something goes right, and believe they are obeying the command in Proverbs 3, when all their actions and thoughts couldn't be further from Him, because see, it's a heart thing. Acknowledging God doesn't mean just turning to Him in times of crisis or publicly during worship. This is truly in all your ways, public and private, religious and secular. It's everything, all your ways, public, private, religiously in church, secular. It's all about acknowledging Him in every possible way. It's knowing that His Word in and out, and I guarantee you'll begin to follow the path that He has for you. The meaning of He will direct your path in Proverbs 3:6 is to make them straight and even pleasant and prosperous. That'd be nice, right? No bumps in the road. Well, I don't think so. That doesn't mean that nothing in life will ever go wrong. Rather than even the bad things will be bearable because God is sharing the load with you. And you know He has an amazing reward planned for you. I read Matthew Henry's concise commentary on Proverbs 3, and sometimes it can get really heady, but there are times where it's very good. And I thought it'd be beautiful, and I summed up how we must approach the acknowledgement of God. It said, "Those who know themselves find their own understanding, a broken reed which, if they lean upon it, will fail." So if you're sitting there depending on yourself, pretty well tells you, doesn't it? Do not design anything but what is lawful, and beg God to direct thee in every case, though it may seem quite plain. So yeah, people say, well, and see, God will not, because of the Holy Spirit, He will direct you. The Spirit will, you'll get to a point it'll just be a natural thing. In all your ways that prove pleasant, in which we gain our point, we must acknowledge God with thankfulness. In all our ways that prove uncomfortable, and that are hedged up with thorns, we must acknowledge Him with submission. It is a promise. He shall direct the path, so that thy way shall be safe and good and happy at last. So I really, as I went through and I thought, acknowledging God. Often we don't acknowledge Him. Often we try to figure it out ourselves. Often we rely on our own thinking, our own emotions, and we don't rely on Him. So I told you this would be a short message tonight. I just want you to remember God's past, God's past faithfulness depend on God's present faithfulness, and expect God's future faithfulness. Remember God's past faithfulness, depend on God's present faithfulness, and expect God's future faithfulness. And I know it sounded a lot like the message I had on Sunday morning. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And on last Sunday, I actually spoke about the yesterdays, the God of yesterday. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that. This is going to be a 2 to 4 part series, depending, because He's, as you get to know who God is, you'll find out you know Him even less, it seems like, but you'll know Him a lot more than the person that never reads the Word, never fellowships, and never prays. So as I'm closing, remember God's past faithfulness in your life, depend on God's present faithfulness at this moment, and expect God's future faithfulness. God bless, take care, and I know your week is going to get a lot better.